that he is either going to be killed and his grave will never be known, the guns will rebury him over and over and over again, or he will get his private parts shot off. So this is the final night. So what does she do? She decides, all right, tonight I have to break all the normal rules and we have to have sex. And that is where it started. Not in the 1960s, not with the hippie culture, not with the baby boom, but in the First World War, where women were about to lose for good. Right? So that is one tiny aspect. The second aspect is only the best in the Second World War. In the First World War, only the best died. The percentage of officers to men who were killed was 60-40. So if you have 60 officers died for every 40 men. The objective was kill the officer because the officer was out in front. They were leaders, they were real leaders. Right? Now I gave you a piece of paper there which is called The Saddest Story of the 20th Century. I want you to keep that and I want you to read it because I feel it's one of the better pieces of writing that I have done. Pat myself on the back. Right? But it encapsulates what the First World War really taught, what it caused. The war was, where the blackboard gone? Blackboard gone, put the blackboard, lay it up on the desk in here. The war ran from Newport on the coast to the Swiss border. 400 miles of trenches. When it's over, when we're over tonight, go into the museum and have a look at our mock trench to see the kind of conditions that men lived under for 4 years. And it is trying to recreate that we give these lectures so that we don't forget. We don't forget what sacrifices men made. And during the course of this training, these trainees behind were asked on several occasions to do exams, of course, exams with 120, 130 questions. And they were asked to do essays. And one essay in particular stood out above all others. And I'm going to ask Guinevere, who will be our moderator, to read her essay for you on the First World War, on war in period, as a general thing. Right? She's the head of this department. Now I'll be sitting here, so that if any of you think of some kind of questions that they can't answer, I'll back them up. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Excellent. An excellent turnout. And now we have Guinevere.
Good evening, everyone. Well, you all already know my name. Mr. Sweet told you. If you forgot, it's Guinevere. You can call me Gwen, if you want. Or if you want to be more formal, Mrs. Huggins is fine too. Or Gwenny, whoever said that. That's a daddy name. Mr. Kelshol, he has a good habit of bringing the best out in everybody, especially women. He has a thing with females. That's why it's mostly girls up here. Okay, now he wants to bring the best out in us. That's why we're up here tonight. Mr. Sweet said that it's a lecture. I beg to differ a little bit. It's more of a group discussion. I hope that you all would enlighten us and we'll enlighten you with what we know. We'd like to impart the knowledge or the things that we learned over the year that we were doing military history. And hopefully you might learn something new and we might learn something from you all. So humbly, we're up here to enlighten you a little more on the First World War. Now, my essay is not only on the First World War, it's about man and war. We kept having a lot of problems with that throughout all of our classes. It always ended up in a big argument over men and war and why war started. So we wrote an essay on it. Okay, Man and War by me. April 1915, World War I. There is furious bombardment and enemy artillery fire. Then, 2 greenish-yellow clouds creep out across no man's land. They spread laterally and cloak the French section. The air is heavy with fear. Men's eyes are burning, their throat is tightening, and they clutch their chest, gasping for breath. They are gassed, machine-gunned, shelled, then buried in the futility of this war to end all wars. Today, we can safely say there is no war to end all wars. Herbert Hoover once said, "Older men declare war, but it is the youth that must fight and die these young brave men did." Today, technology and the creation of weapons for mass destruction is far too advanced for mankind and the universe to survive a war of that type. On the other hand, the problem exists that the same peace body, which we need to save the world from the worst wars to come, is the same one that harbors the terrorist groups that are the problem. Iran, Iraq, amongst other guilty parties, serve on the UN Council. How just is that? The problem is the world is far gone in evil, and unfortunately, realistically, we will have to quell that evil, whatever it takes. Further to this, to understand the union of man and warfare, we must first understand what war is. A war is any active hostility or struggle between living things, a conflict between opposing forces or principles. Thus, to have this war, there must be a will to conflict. It can also be a campaign to end something destructive. For example, our war on crime today in Trinidad. A war can be ethical, moral, and just, to simply right a wrong, and then it can be unjust and immoral, with collateral losses, violence, murders, and massacres, leaving thousands, sometimes millions, dead in its wake. War always starts with a purpose or noble intent, but then it spreads like a germ or disease to neighboring countries, to allies, to enemies, and through broken treaties. War ultimately breeds war, and one of the causes of war is war. It is a vicious circle, and the hardest thing to end because its beginning and end are usually not done by the same man. Since the beginning of time, man was at war. Our basic human needs of food, water, shelter, clothing, and most important, our security, were always threatened. Take away any one of these and there may be a fight. One must learn to take responsibility for his own life and solve his own problems, rather than blame his neighbor for his insecurities. It happens every day. In the home, at the office, in Trinidad, in the world. Hence, Germany cannot solely be responsible for our world wars. Everyone is. From the government, to the politicians, to the generals, to the South American drummer boys, John Victory and John Louis of the immortal 45, urging the men on with the beat of their drum to vicious pressures, to painting yellow the homes and barns of those who failed to subscribe in World War I, to the woman pinning the white feather on the man who will not fight, and finally, to the splendidly dressed, naive soul with perfect conviction, marching on to his death with his band of brothers. We are all responsible for the horrors of war. From the near extinction of the Amerindian race, to the ravages of our beloved St. Joseph by the conquistadors of Spain, who waged their wars for Spain, for king and country. From the buccaneers with their revengeries, to the senseless slaughter of World War I, to our present problems, man has always fought for greed and power. Another way to produce conflict is change. Most people do not handle change well. When Brigadier General Thomas Picton became governor of Trinidad, granted his method of governing was quite unorthodox. The revolutionaries at that time in 1797 were opposed to him and his changes. War was imminent every day that Picton was in charge, but he skillfully managed to keep his people under his control with offensive strikes and brilliant propaganda. That was Picton's war. Another reason for war is to maintain or secure peace. Jesus once told the Israelites to rise up and fight the Romans. They made the morally sound decision to have a war, to have peace. They had to protect their very existence, man's basic need of security. Today, the agents of war have corrected many mistakes of the past. There are now conditions for waging war and rules that must be followed to limit its consequences and not have a repeat of casualties. We should be enlightened by past generals such as Patton, with his encyclopedic knowledge of military campaigns. He once said, "To be a successful soldier, you must know your history." When faced with an aggressor, there are three different viewpoints or positions which one must take: the just war theory, the theory of realism, and that of pacifism. The just war theory states that a just war is morally sound and justified only if it is done as a last resort. All efforts must be exhausted at peace before advancing to warfare. Some just wars in history with just cause would be World War II. On the defensive Allied side, because of Nazi Germany's advancement into Poland in 1939 with armed force. Hitler used this war as a means of advancement for Germany. He also used revenge and spread his hate message through his Nazi regime, then ultimately the horrid persecution and ethnic cleansing of the Jews. Iraq into Kuwait in 1990. Serbia, Kosovo in 1998 is another justified war. Protection from brutal regimes, as in the massacre in Rwanda in 1994, and of course America's war on terror with Iran and Iraq. This just war theory is a balance between Roman and Christian values. Some of the older philosophers, and ultimately the founders of this theory, are Aristotle, Cicero, and Augustine. Their values have evolved today into international laws governing armed conflict between states, namely the UN Council and the Geneva Conventions. To keep wartime somewhat civilized, there are rules and guidelines to follow. One such rule is just cause. One must have just cause for resorting to war initially, and it must be deemed legitimate by a proper authority, in this case the UN. As a result of the 9/11 attacks, President Bush would have consulted his council and the UN before justifiably waging his war. An anticipated attack is another legitimate reason for war. If a warranted threat is anticipated, one can launch preemptive strikes. As mentioned before, Lieutenant General Thomas Picton's whole theory on war was based on these preemptive strikes. Preemptive offensive strikes wherever and whenever he assumed impending danger to Trinidad. A fine example of this would be La Guerrilla of Venezuela, when he marched his soldiers in to dissipate the revolutionaries who were planning an attack on Trinidad. He knocked the wind out of their sails before they could even practically plan their next move. Every time Picton assumed a threat and did these preemptive strikes, ironically, he had peace. Israel is another who is fond of using the preemptive strikes theory on war. They are, though, only temporary solutions to peace. If one knows a terrible attack is imminent, one owes it to one's people to shift from defense to offense. As they say, the best defense is a good offense. Another condition for waging war is that one must have the right intention. The war must not be based on self-interest or personal gain. The first person who comes to mind that abused this theory is General Falkenhayn. His intention in Verdun 1916, World War I, was to bleed France white. Verdun was attacked on 21st February by the German 5th Army under the Butcher of Verdun, Crown Prince Wilhelm. Instead of just taking Forts Dormont and Vaux, Falkenhayn insisted on continual bombardment, which resulted in about 1 million casualties, roughly on